National debt could hit 100 trillion by 2037 if the Trump budget is ignored. Cuts 4.4 trillion in 10 years. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today we're going to be talking about the U.S. budget. President Trump and the Office of Management and Budget have submitted another budget. They're required to do this under law every year, and this time it's going to cut $4.4 trillion over 10 years and reach balance in about 15 years. And I got to say, this is better than any proposals we see out of Congress on an annual basis. They tend to ignore the president's budget regardless of who's in power. And so even if the president says, let's cut $4 trillion of spending over 10 years, that doesn't mean that Congress is going to act on that proposal. In fact, I highly doubt that they will, although we hope they ought to, because the national debt is going to continue growing much, much faster than the U.S. economy. It has been doing so historically for decades now. And we have to look at reality of where we stand fiscally as a nation, I believe. And that's going to be a bipartisan thing. That's going to require both parties to really look at these numbers and really consider what the that downstream consequences of spending far more than the economy is growing is going to have on this country. Now, just to touch briefly on the president's proposals, I mentioned 4.4 trillion of spending cuts. And here's the president's budget, a budget for America's future. When you look at the numbers, President Trump and OMB are proposing to spend about $56.3 trillion over the next 10 years in comparison to the 60.7 trillion, almost 60.8 trillion, that's currently in the baseline scenario that OMB came up with. This is how much money. Well, if nothing changes in U.S. law, we're going to spend $60.7 trillion. If you adopt the Trump budget, though, that's going to only be 56.3 trillion, and that's going to get you to a balanced budget within 15 years if you stay on that path. But unless Congress acts on those proposals, the government's going to continue to spend the monies already allocated under law and then some, causing the national debt, now $23.2 trillion, to continue to skyrocket. I think this is the most likely scenario. Since 1980, the national debt has averaged 8.7% growth every single year, but the economy nominally, that is before adjusting for inflation, has only grown about 5.4% annually. So that if those trends continue, by 2037, the national debt will have reached a whopping $100 trillion, or about 192% of debt to GDP, because the economy would, if you say it's only going to grow by 5.4%, but the debt's going to grow by 8.7%, well, you're going to have a $100 trillion debt with only a $56.5 trillion economy. So, and what makes it worse, and the reason we're in this pickle, is because U.S. Treasury markets, it incentivizes vast spending schemes in Congress because of rising market demand for U.S. Treasuries. You can see this playing out in real time. Interest rates have been declining for over 30 years now. And here you see the 10-year Treasury at 1.6%. That's really low. It's less than 1.6%. And the reason for that is because of rising demand for U.S. Treasuries. The more demand there is for U.S. Treasury bonds, the lower the interest rates go. So the fact that interest rates have been collapsing for 30 years incentivizes the creation of government debt. So investors say, go deeper into debt so that we can buy more treasuries. In fact, there's probably, if you look at market demand for U.S. dollar denominated assets, I don't think there's enough supply per se to meet the global demand. That's why interest rates are going to continue probably collapsing and may even go negative at some point in the not so distant future, which I think would be a catastrophe for capitalism. It creates all sorts of weird, perverse incentives. Here, we are currently, just even before you go negative, we're incentivized to go deeper and deeper into debt. You could have 200, 300% debt to GDP. You could be in the land of European sovereign debt crisis, or you could be more like Japan, which has not really grown nominally that much in the past 20 years or so. In the meantime, their debt has grown dramatically. And I think that could be a kind of a dystopian, slower growth future, if you want to look at it that way, where you have a really large debt, your population is not growing too much, and the economy is not growing at all. And I think that sort of stagnation would be a major blow for the global economy, but most certainly for the U.S. economy. I think the President Trump and his budget, I think they're looking at alternatives where we can cut spending and keep the economy growing. We're not going to raise taxes too much. And the fact is that the working age population has been slowing in growth. That is to say, Americans are having fewer children than they once did. And so you're not going to get as much of a boost from revenues and receipts. And, Democrats say, oh, let's raise taxes. Republicans say, no, let's do tax cuts. And in the meantime, everyone's increasing spending. So if you can, I don't think you can, tax your way out of this. I think that actually you need to spend less to meet up with the more limited resources, fewer taxpayers, so to speak, being created on a generational basis. And that's going to help you to get to more balance. Even during the Obama years from 2011 through 2016, the growth of spending was much, much slower with sequestration. And while the economy was still recovering from the financial crisis, so increases in revenues, but spending was kind of frozen, especially on the discretionary side, and that helped to reduce the budget deficit with a Republican House and then a Republican House and Senate starting in 2015. Since the President Trump came into office, though, he's been submitting budgets that cut about $4 trillion or so dollars over 10 years, but the Congress has never adopted any of the Trump budgets. They just do what they want to do. They say, oh, well, the spending, well, yeah, we're going to increase spending on defense, which the president does propose, but he also proposes on an overall basis saying, let's cut spending here, let's cut spending there, let's reform things like food stamps. And that's going to basically help to get the budget to be cut by over $4 trillion over 10 years. But we're not getting there because Congress doesn't act on it. Now, the main reason for the steady growth of the debt is that 2/3 of the federal budget operates on autopilot with outlays baked into law, so-called mandatory spending, things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth. And Congress says we're not going to touch that. We're not going to touch Social Security. We're not going to cut Medicare. We're not going to touch Medicaid. Those things are going to stay the way they are under current law. And both parties seem to agree with that. So meaning if you're going to cut spending, it's got to be somewhere else. And, the president's committed to higher defense spending. So that further limits the areas where you can cut to non-defense discretionary spending. But also some of these other big ticket programs, take Obamacare. You could cut a lot of spending. The president's budget proposes cutting Obamacare, saying we don't need Obamacare anymore. We don't have to do these insurance subsidies. And that will help to cut spending. You can save money that way. There are lots of ways you can cut spending without saying, let's go after Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid for that matter. And if seniors who depend on Medicaid, they're going to, they could be, kind of living alone, and then they're going to go, and they might wind up on Medicaid. I don't think anyone's proposing to cut that. When you talk about Medicaid expansion, that's not really affecting seniors. Seniors were already collecting Medicaid. Those are for individuals who were in the so-called donut hole, who were making too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but maybe didn't have employer-based insurance. And so Obamacare sought to accommodate those Americans. But even if you just wanted to leave the Medicaid expansion in place or Obamacare, I mean, that's a likely outcome. You have a Democratic Congress. They're unlikely to cut or to repeal Obamacare. You'll have to get a Republican Congress and a Republican president. They'll try to repeal Obamacare again if that happens in 2020. But in the meantime, you have to find other areas where you can cut. If Congress can't find anything to cut that they can agree on between both parties, with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate and a Republican president, guess what? Spending's not going to be cut. We're probably not going to do anything much on taxes either. So you're kind of at the status quo here, which is what concerns me, is that when you eventually hit an economic downturn, I don't think there's going to be one this year, but maybe in the coming years, certainly the business cycle is likely to come to an end. You could be in a situation where revenues are going to take a big hit because of a coming recession a few years from now or many years from now, whenever it occurs. Usually Congress then engages in counter-cyclical spending, where they'll increase spending because the economy is slowing down. Meanwhile, revenues will take a big hit, and then you can see ballooning deficits. And then I think that scenario where the debt grows by more than 8% a year, but the economy's growing slower than that, you could see a repeat of that scenario if not this year, but in coming years. So there is a worrisome scenario where you get to $100 trillion of debt by 2037 if you don't start cutting spending right now. That's why we support the Trump budget. He's the only one out there right now promoting spending cuts that I think can get us to a balanced budget and prevent such a catastrophic scenario. Now, that being said, it may not be all that bad. The economy has actually been growing at a nominal 4.6% a year since 2017. And the debt's been growing by about 5.1% since 2017. So if those two things remain true, 5.1% growth on debt, 4.6 nominal growth on the economy, by 2037, you won't be at 192% debt to GDP. It'll be more like 118%, not such a terrible scenario as the other scenario I outlined. That said, you want to look at, well, what if things are really bad, or what if things are not so bad? And then you can start to make decisions based upon that. We encourage Congress to look at this worrisome scenario and take it seriously, because I think it is a real possibility. Since 1980, the national debt's been growing by 8.7%. The economy's only grown by 5.4% a year. So if you take those two things to be true and you say carry it out and you say, what if we continue going on this path? You could have a catastrophic debt scenario. Will you have a funding crisis? I think if we do, it will be because of the perverse incentives, because investors are saying, give us more treasury bonds, keep producing treasury bonds, keep borrowing, America, and we'll cover you. Treasury markets got you. In the meantime, that might not always be true. And so you have to plan for the future. That's why Congress has to prioritize. The annual failure is that 2/3 of the budget operates on autopilot. And so Congress really doesn't consider almost all of the budget. It's just baked into the law, and they're not changing the law. Nobody can compromise. Americans for Limited Government President Rick Manning issued a statement praising the Trump budget and urged Congress to act now, saying, quote, "The President Trump continues to produce budgets that provide a pathway to balance in 15 years with $4.4 trillion of cuts over 10 years. It is up to Congress to pass appropriations bills that include a similar commitment to cutting the deficit." Unfortunately, Democratic politicians like House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer continue to attack President Trump for the escalating budget deficit while ignoring their primary role in increasing government spending. If Congress worked and the House majority actually wanted to govern, they would make budget deficit reduction a primary focus in 2020. Unfortunately, what they really want is to blame the president for their credit card abuse. It is time for Americans to tell Congress to cut the budget now. I agree with that. Rick Manning, he's my boss here at Americans for Limited Government. He's absolutely right. Congress needs to act now, and I'll leave you with the close here. With Congress, when it comes to the debt, the sky's the limit, meaning President Trump's budget with modest 4.4 trillion over 10 years, that's a very modest cuts in comparison to what we're proposing. They say we're going to spend almost 61 trillion over the next 10 years. Trump's saying, no, let's spend more like 56 trillion. I think that's a modest cut. And it really, it's the only game in town. The president's budget, if you want to cut spending, that's like a roadmap. Everyone should look at the president's budget. You can get it at whitehouse.gov, a budget for America's future, fiscal year 2021. It may not balance the budget immediately, but at least there's a horizon there, and that's more than Congress can say. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.